want to clarify, first of all, that in referring to CBO, I'm not talking about making CBO the enforcement arm. I share your concern that that would create its own range of constitutional problems. I'm saying simply that that could narrow any discovery that might need to be conducted in court. If Congress were to say, we're going to use CBO numbers, we'll look at those, Congress would then have the opportunity to accept or reject their own estimates, and that would narrow the litigation possibilities, the opportunity for discovery significantly, to the point that I think it could be shortened. But I want to get back to the point about the oath to the Constitution. Each of us, when we're sworn in as members of Congress, are required to take an oath to uphold the Constitution and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. That does have an effect. Much as our popularity rating among the American people, which is somewhere to the south of that of Fidel Castro, might suggest otherwise, members of Congress, when faced with very specific commands, do tend to take those very specific constitutional obligations quite seriously. Let me point to one of the examples that rarely gets brought up, which is the impeachment and removal of sitting presidents. You had a situation a few years ago in which a Democratic president was not removed after having been impeached by the House, was not removed by the Senate, notwithstanding the fact that the Senate was Republican-controlled and this president was a Democrat. One of the reasons why that president was not removed, even though the votes might have been there if they wanted to, there was extensive discussion about what it means to have committed a high crime or misdemeanor. There was founding era documentation of what that really meant, and there were a number of members of this body in both parties who said, you know, I don't think this is it. Congress does police itself fairly well, especially when it knows that the buck stops with Congress. And so I really think that we ought to avoid any situation in which we're simply going to assume Congress won't follow it. This has to result in litigation. And the only way that this could ever be enforced would be through litigation. I simply reject that viewpoint. I'd like to ask a question to you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin. Don't you think an argument can be made? Do you agree with my viewpoint, and if so, why, that the longer we postpone requiring Congress to balance its budget and to live within certain parameters of spending, that we really are jeopardizing the very same programs that we're talking today about, that many have expressed concern about preserving?
Absolutely. Our social safety net is broken. I mean, Social Security right now is running a $50 billion cash flow deficit. The current plan, and I put that in quotes because it's a disgrace, is for future retirees to get an across-the-board cut of 23% so that we maintain the solvency of the system. That's terrible. That should be fixed. Medicare right now, there's a gap of $280 billion between premiums and payroll taxes in and spending going out. And 10,000 seniors are retiring every day. That program will not survive for the next generation of seniors. And so we should be fixing these now for the programs and beneficiaries' sakes, plus the red ink and the economic consequences.
So those are problems that in some respects go above and beyond the present day problems that we face from our debt, in other words.
Yes.
How far do you think we have to go before our interest rates or the yield rates we have to pay on U.S. Treasury instruments start to return even just to historical levels, let alone start to go grease on us?
Truth is, we don't know. In the end, these are relative comparisons, and we have the virtue of being the best-looking horse in the glue factory at the moment. But those relative comparisons can switch quickly, and I don't think we should take any comfort in that. I was asked the same question on a panel in the other body, and I was sitting next to Carmen Reinhardt, who is a subject matter expert on this. And my answer was, I don't know how long we have. We should pretend we have no time. And she said, Doug's an optimist. And I take that seriously.
Great. That's very helpful. Thank you. Dr. Diana, yeah. I did want to point out in response to your testimony the provision dealing with the military conflict or declaration of war that is different in the consensus Republican proposal, Senate Joint Resolution 10. That extends only to the extent of the funds required to be that have to be expended in connection with that war or military conflict. Oh. So the specific excess has to be identified, and then the specific excess above the spending restraints of this provision would be limited to that military conflict, and so that isn't present at that moment.
Yeah, that's a big improvement.
Oh, thank you. I thought so, and we worked pretty hard on that. I see that my time has expired. I thank each of you for coming.
Senator Lee, you've been very patient and returned. If you'd like to continue for a couple minutes, please feel free.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Morrison, with respect to standing, couldn't Congress, pursuant to what I analogize to our version of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, the portion of this that says Congress may, through appropriate legislation, take steps to enforce this provision, couldn't Congress provide through that legislation that members of Congress could, under certain limited circumstances, have standing to sue under this provision and establish standing? Or is it your position that Raines versus Byrd conclusively resolves that issue and that there is no possibility that they could satisfy Article 3 standing requirements in that circumstance?
My view is that Raines would control and that Congress could not, and the Supreme Court would agree that it could not create standing for members of Congress or anybody else. But if, as you are, aware of the standing problem and believe that standing is important to have enforcement, then I agree that your SJ Res 5 does the right thing if you want to confer standing on members of Congress by putting it in the Constitution. The Supreme Court would honor that. It would not necessarily agree to hear the case because, as my testimony points out, the political question doctrine, as well as ripeness and mootness, would also stand in the way. And surely the political question doctrine, focusing mainly on the issue of remedy, I think, as the quotation from Justice Scalia indicates, the court would be very reluctant to assume that Congress intended to make it the arbiters of the federal budget.
And you may well be right in that respect, in that the court may well be reluctant to become the first and last arbiter of the federal budget. That being the case, I think that plays in exactly to my point about how members of Congress, particularly when they understand that the buck stops with them as far as their interpretation of a particular constitutional provision. For example, those clauses dealing with the impeachment power, the power to remove individual members of Congress, the power to ratify treaties, the power to override a presidential veto, things like that. Members of Congress have tended, have they not, to abide by the Constitution.
Yes, and if you want to say that the federal court shall stay out of it, then you ought to say that in your amendment to make it absolutely clear the federal courts don't get into it, and the American people can then decide, based upon a clear statement in the amendment, that we're going to depend upon Congress to enforce this amendment, and we're not going to depend on anybody else. I think many people would think that it would be empty rhetoric, and by the time the amendment got passed and got enacted by all the states, we'd be another 5 years down the road, and everybody'd say, we're waiting for the amendment to take place, then nirvana will arrive and all our problems will go away. I don't think that's a very good bet.
But aren't there countless circumstances in which we benefit from the fact that there is some perhaps minimal uncertainty? There's sort of Damocles effect in the fact that the courts could step in a given circumstance. Doesn't that keep members of Congress honest?
I don't think in this situation they would.
Well, why is this situation any different than any other situation?
Because in this situation, the temptations to exceed the budget limits are so great, given all the pressures from outside groups. The very reason we have this problem today, because it's easier to say yes than it is to say no. That's why we have the problem. The once-in-a-generation impeachment is not the same as the regular annual budget cycle, campaign contributions, all the things that cause members of Congress to do what they do in creating deficits. I don't think that this alone may do it. Maybe Congress should just pass a joint resolution that every member of Congress takes an oath to see that there's a balanced budget, and everyone say we'll run upon it next year in the election. At least that wouldn't be enshrined in the Constitution, and we wouldn't have any litigation over that.
Although we could find a way to litigate that too, and I'm sure we'd want to retain you.
I'm pretty good at that. I think I would have there's also the speech and debate clause, which I've got backed up for you if you don't want to worry about that kind of litigation.
Okay, but your bottom line analysis is fish or cut bait, either put standing in the amendment itself or leave it out and leave it something that is committed constitutionally to Congress's discretion?
Yeah, and I would say standing and political question also.
Okay. Thank you.